Hello, and welcome to E.G. the Virgo, to another chapter of An Unusual Kind, that 1%, based on actual experiences and theories. One life, 5 generations. This story includes entertaining fictional and non-fictional images, animations, videos, and music by artists and photographers unrelated and in no way were created for this particular story and or documentary. Some names, dates, and times were changed to protect the privacy and identities of the characters within the story. I just want to make sure that you all have a full understanding and enjoyment and appreciation to this type of documentary, so to say. So we're going to go right into our disclosure. Copyright disclaimer. Under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976, allowance is made for fair use purposes such as criticism, comments, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Fair use is a use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Nonprofit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use. Our source is from Circular 92, Copyright Law of the United States, 17 U.S.C. Section 107. Okay, this story here, this particular chapter that we're about to get into is really something. It gives you something to think about. And just wondering if any of you have ever experienced anything like that. And if you have, look back at this story and wonder. Okay, this is chapter 16, called Tree Spirits. And remember, you don't have to listen to me. You can pause me and read it for yourself. I'm just reading it because there are folks who may have a disability, some kind of disability that prevents them from reading somehow. So if you want, you don't have to listen to me. You can, again, remember, you can always pause it and read it yourself and go through your own pages and just forward it to your next page. Okay, so without further ado, we're going to get into Tree Spirits. After moving from the house in the suburbs that scared and kept E up almost each night with the sound of disembodied footsteps on the staircase, E and her family moved back to the city, where E and her brother would still have to share the smallest bedroom in the house, and her two older sisters would still have to share the second biggest bedroom. And of course, E's mother slept in the biggest bedroom in the house, called the master bedroom. Each of the two smaller bedrooms of the three were very spacious, so everyone still had their own little space within the bedrooms. The house was a spacious 3-bedroom, 1-bath, split-level, 2-story brick row home with a full-sized open floor plan basement, a nice, clean, spacious, gray-painted wooden front porch with a small grassy front yard, neatly trimmed with a mixture of 4 feet hedges and sticky bushes, or bushes with thorns, that's what we used to call them. We called them sticky bushes. I don't know what you guys call them, but that's what we called them back in the day. The house also had a set of 4 gray painted wooden steps which led outside from the backyard door of the house, with a small top landing that could be used as a small sitting area in the backyard, in addition to a very nice, clean 4-foot cast iron fence in the little backyard area with beautiful green grass, which faced the backyards of other brick row homes that were divided by a long, clean, narrow, cemented walkway, commonly referred to as an alleyway, that neatly traveled behind all the beautiful uniformed backyards of the brick row homes that faced one another. The alley went from one side of the block all the houses were built on to the other side of the block. The alleyway was just wide enough for people to walk through side by side, or for E to ride her bicycle through. Though if she chose to do so, she could use the alleyway as a shortcut to get to the other side of her block instead of riding all the way around the big four-sided block of her city street. Now that you all have an idea of this house, its setup, and its environment, which is what the author was trying to paint here and give you an image of what these houses were like, what was E's life like, to give you an idea of how E was growing up, which really is no different from how probably many of you grew up. However, this is E's experience, and the author wants you to see and feel that. Can you see the image the author is trying to paint, in addition to giving you a couple of visuals? So now that we have that out the way, let's move on to the next page. The good thing about this row home is it's set right across a small street with a nice, clean, quiet park that was about a quarter in length to a football field. This rectangular shaped park only had 4 big, thick, healthy, strong, fully matured, tall maple trees, grass, and was trimmed in cement curbing. Strange enough, the trees sat perfectly positioned at each end of the park, side by side one another like a football goalpost. You know, just like football goalposts. And I'm trying to give you the visual of that. So you can kind of picture, if you know what a football field look like, then you can picture the park with the 2 trees at each end. And continuing, as if they were planted that way intentionally. However, as big as those maple trees were, which was over 40 feet, they were obviously there far longer than the row homes, which looked like they were possibly built in the mid to late 1950s. Most of the little boys in the neighborhood would use the park to play football in, which is what the park actually looked like it was designed for, but it wasn't. Especially with 2 of the maple trees perfectly spaced side by side at each end of the park, which the little boys would use as football goalpost markers for them to score a touchdown. Directly across on the other side of the park was another small street which traveled the opposite direction of the small street that ran in front of E's house. Was a sister's convent building that ran in front of E's house. Was it ran in front of E's house, and it was all fenced in, all fenced around, with a big dark brown wall of stonework, brown stonework. The stonework fencing looked like they were from an old traditional castle from the medieval times. Everything, including the house, appeared big and beautiful to E and her siblings. To them, life was grand. That just sounds beautiful. So again, the author is trying to paint you this environment, this inner city environment that's rare to find. It's kind of like the inner city put away a little beautiful pocket to the side. So this is still in the city somewhere where they live. But a beautiful part of the city. Quiet, nice little park, kids play, not noisy or anything. And that's what the author is trying to give you, that image. So again, that's why I said this chapter It's going to be a little bit more different with a twist to it at the end. Let's continue. Nevertheless, 8-year-old E had taken a special liking to the park. Almost every day, every day that it wasn't raining or snowing outside, E would take her baby doll and toy stroller for a walk over to the grassy park. And each time E would pretend she was going shopping or taking her baby doll to daycare. E would pick up small tree branches, rocks, and handfuls of grass and put them into a little bag, pretending they were items she bought from her imaginary supermarket. During E's playtime at the park, E would be hand gesturing and talking out loud to her imaginary world of people whenever she was alone in the park, which also included each of the 4 big maple trees. Okay? E would imagine the trees were her friends and advisors whenever she played at the park. E never felt alone at the park because she knew the trees were there to keep her company. E had a young, wonderful, healthy, and active imagination. E would sometimes pretend that she was in some sort of a conflict with one of her imaginary people and would take the conflict to the trees in order for the matter to be resolved. She would take it up with the trees, okay? She's like, let's go take this up with the trees here. E would fairly present her case and the case of her imaginary person to the 2 trees closest to E's house across the street. Now, E's house was across the street from this little park. Surprisingly, E didn't win every case and humbly accepted the decision and advice of the wise trees, who were much older than E and who would be, how would they say, would know better than E. The other 2 trees, which were further from E's house, were used as backup in case E was down at the other end of the park. This way, no matter what end of the park E played at, she always had the trees there to make sure everything stayed fair, fun, and in order. E felt the 4 trees communicated with one another and was very familiar with her, and the trees were very familiar with her and her baby doll as they would watch her happily play. If E wasn't riding her big wheel up, down, and around the blocks she lived on with some of the new friends that she met, E would go off by herself and spend at least 2 hours at the park with the trees in her own little imaginary world. E believed the trees felt happier whenever she came over to talk, play, and interact with them. Now, isn't that interesting? Whenever E had to leave the park, E would take the time to smile, wave her hand, and say goodbye to the 4 trees and literally give each tree a hug before she left the park. How loving. She's very lovingly, wasn't she? Uncannily, E never gave any of the trees a name. And that's something. One day, E's mother gave her a little birthday celebration for E's 9th birthday. In attendance was E's sisters, brother, boy cousin, E's mother, and aunt. Everyone was enjoying themselves. E's mother pulled out the grand surprise, which was a brand new 2-wheeled pink Huffy bike. E's eyes lit up with joy and excitement. E began riding her bike immediately around the block multiple times as E's family and visitors watched with joy. E was never a selfish person, so she also let her brother and boy cousin have a ride around the block on her brand new bike as well. That was her birthday bike. She said, hey, you guys can see how it rides too. E, her brother, and boy cousin continued taking turns riding around the block on E's new bike, despite her brother having a bike too. They all liked the way the pink Huffy was built and how well and smooth it would ride. After a while, E's family went back into the house and E stayed outside riding her birthday bike. E rode her bike across the street to show the trees what she got for her 9th birthday. Although E knew the trees were right across the street from her house and could see everything going on in front of her house, E wanted to personally take her bike over to the trees to have a closer look. So they can have a closer look, if you know what I mean. E got off of her bike in the park, put the kickstand down to keep the bike from falling to the ground, and went closer to the trees and sat down on the grassy ground to tell them about her birthday party. E believed the trees had a good time listening and asked the 2 trees she was talking with for them to tell the other 2 trees at the other end of the park what she was saying, so she wouldn't have to ride all the way down to the other end and say the same things again. Basically, didn't want to have to repeat herself. And according to E, the trees agreed to do so. Well, now, while E was happily in the middle of telling the trees all about her birthday celebration, all of a sudden, an unusual, strong September gust of wind came, and the tops of the trees began blowing vigorously. E began looking around while she was still sitting on the ground facing the 2 trees closest to her house, wondering where that sudden gust of wind had come from and why. E looked into the sky and saw it wasn't cloudy or anything, and the wind briefly stopped. So E continued talking and telling the trees her story. The entire time, E was so focused on telling her story to the 2 trees that E never looked behind her. Again, another gust of wind came, and this time much harder and longer than the first gust of wind. This time E stood up and began looking around, and again at the sky all around her, as well as the sky in back of her where she could see the tops of the trees. The other 2 trees at the end, or at the other end of the park, which were blowing even more aggressively. When E turned to look at the sky and trees in back of her, she noticed a teenage boy walking 2 full-grown German Shepherds. Actually, German Shepherd dogs without their leash. E also noticed the 2 trees in front of her she was talking to began blowing so hard it looked and sounded like some of the tree branches were cracking. By the time E had stood up and turned all the way around to see the teenager and his dogs, they were already more than halfway to where E was standing in front of the 2 trees. The dogs were much closer to E than a teenage boy, who was casually walking behind the dogs. The dogs were playing with one another and not paying any attention to E. By this time, the wind had completely stopped. Everything in nature went quiet. No sound of birds nor the distant laughter or talking from others in the neighborhood. E became very concerned that the dogs weren't on a leash and they were playing pretty close to where she was standing. E remembered she was told not to run from a dog, but to try to carefully walk away if possible. However, E was too scared to even move one step closer to get her bike so she could leave. The bike just stood standing with its pretty pink and white streamers coming out the ends of the handlebar grips. E didn't want to leave her bike in fear someone would steal it if she left it. But even if E wanted to leave, the dogs were too close for E to make a 70-foot beeline run towards her house directly across the small street from where E was standing in front of the two big maple trees. E stood quietly, panting with her heart beating hard while she stared at the teenager, hoping he would see her and call his dogs back to him. Instead, when the teenager saw E and noticed she looked frightened of his two dogs, the teenager quickly hissed a settled, quiet command to his dogs that E was all too familiar with from having family dogs of their own. Sicker. The dogs, with their keen hearing, instantly stopped playing due to the command they heard hissing from their owner's mouth. And then at the exact same time, both dogs turned their heads back towards E and locked eyes with her. E knew this wasn't good. Without barking, the dogs suddenly began charging towards E full speed. E backed up against one of the trees, suddenly began frantically screaming to the top of her lungs, "Mom!" The dogs continued their pursuit full speed until they had E cornered and pinned against a tree. As E continued screaming and had begun crying for her mom, a third gust of wind started, and it was more violent than the first two gusts of winds. It was so violent, the treetops looked as though they were leaning so hard that they looked like they wanted to break totally in half. And the wind also blew over E's bike. Then the two dogs suddenly stopped just 2 feet from E and began just standing, growling, and barking at her. Never once did either of the dogs jump at E. They stood in one spot, just barking at E as if there was some sort of a barrier between them and E. Right at that moment, while E was still yelling for her mom's help, everyone in E's household came running out the front door to see what child was screaming like that outside, When E's mother, siblings, cousin, and aunt saw it was E screaming out there out of fear from two full-grown German Shepherd dogs, they all began moving towards E and the dogs while yelling profanities at the teenager who was just standing there watching his dogs terrify E. Out of nowhere, E's cousin quickly grabs a pogo stick that was laying on the front porch of E's house, held the pogo stick above his head, and crazy enough, it was E's pogo stick, began yelling like an angry caveman, and began running and charging towards the dogs, which caused the teenager and the dogs to turn around and run the opposite way. After making sure E was okay, E's mother and aunt quickly jumped in E's mother's car to follow where the teen would go. They saw the teen run about a block and a half away into another row home. E's mother and aunt came back and called the police on the teenager and gave the police the address of the house the teen and the dogs ran into. The police, E's mother and aunt, went around to the teen's house. The parents of the teen answered the door and was very concerned and cooperative. The parents called the teen from his upstairs bedroom down to the front door to confirm if what the police were saying was true. The teen reluctantly confirmed what the police said was true because he was scared he was going to have to go to jail. The teen, who looked to be about 16 years of age, was unexpectedly and swiftly, angrily smacked upside the back of his head by his father right in front of everyone and the police. The father yelled at the teen for his careless actions and vowed the teen would never be able to take the dogs out again. The mother suggested they would discuss sending the dogs away for good, as the teen broke down begging his parents not to send the dogs away because it was his fault and not the dogs. The parents of the teen couldn't apologize enough to E's mother for their son's behavior and promised nothing like that would ever happen again. The police concluded the conversation by telling the parents to be sure their dogs were on a leash at all times and what the actual law is for anyone using their dogs to senselessly attack others, especially using their dogs to attack kids. The police let the parents off with a verbal warning that time, but said if they received any more complaints involving their dogs, that not only would the dogs be taken away and put down, that means they would be put to sleep, killed by a professional veterinarian, but the owners of the dogs would be held accountable for the actions of the dogs in a court of law, including any and all fees and costs. The parents of the teen nodded in agreement and understanding. As everyone was leaving from standing in front of the teen's house, including their own neighbors who also came out of their houses to see why the police was out there, E's mother and aunt all were outside. They wanted to know why everybody was out there. Everyone could hear the mother and father had continued loudly fussing at the teen inside their house as they closed their front door. So they were pretty loud. He was getting a good tongue lashing. After E's mother and aunt drove back to E's house down the street and around the corner, E's mother checked on E again to see how E was doing since the incident with the dogs. E told her mother she was fine. E's mother and aunt then wondered why or what made the dogs stop and not attack E when they clearly had the time and opportunity to do so. E proudly said to everyone standing around her house that it was the trees. After everyone thanked E's cousin for his bravery in going after the dogs, E's siblings and cousin all later began snickering, laughing, and joking about E's suggestion of the trees also scaring the dogs and keeping them from attacking her, while E's mother and aunt said it was more likely God who stopped the dogs from attacking E. And God used the trees to warn E trouble was coming. However, of course, E was too young and it was too late before she was realizing what the wind was trying to tell her. So, with the help of Eve's cousin charging and yelling at the dogs, in addition to the hard winds and crackling sounds of breaking tree branches, confused and scared the dogs and the teen boy, which made them all turn and run away. So now that we've all come to the end of chapter 16, the tree spirits, you tell me, or basically you think about it, how you thought that chapter went and what you thought. I thought it was very enlightening in that she was able to find comfort in the trees. So until the next time, people, and until we come upon chapter 17, I hope you enjoyed listening and reading chapter 16, The Tree Spirits, just as much as I had fun creating it. And again, I want to thank you all for tuning in and watching and or reading and viewing, e.g. the Virgo, An Unusual Kind, That 1%. And until the next time, people, whatever time zone you're on, please have a good and blessed day.